This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Lager yeast and building character in lagers is the subject of today's Spotlight podcast, brought to you interruption-free by Fermentis, the experts in fermentation for over 160 years. Brewers everywhere depend on Fermentis for yeast that's consistent, controllable, and high quality. Whether you're brewing an ester-forward Belgian-style beer, your favorite IPA, or a clean lager. Through today's episode, we're going to focus on brewing with 3470 and beyond, exploring ways to build expression in lager beers with that workhorse that is used across so many beers, lager, and of course beers that are now sold as ales, even if they are made with 3470. But we're also going to talk about S23 and actually other lager yeasts in the Fermentis catalog that also provide some other avenues of lager expression because, this is brewing and we are trying to explore all of the avenues of brewing and not just create this one monocultural idea of what beer can be. Of course, in this world with beer consumers today, people want to find those things that are individual, interesting. And of course, we all use common ingredients, and something like 3470 is definitely one of those. But there are also ways to find individual expression even using these ingredients. And so we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about some of the other tools in that fermentation toolbox that folks use to do that. Joining me for this podcast, Matt Manthe, who's been on the podcast before, head brewer now at Dillon Dam Brewery in Dillon, Colorado. Welcome back, Matt.
Thanks.
Also joining again, Andrew Foss, head brewer for Human Robot in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Welcome back, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks. How's it going?
Always good, always good. And finally, Moh Saade. You were former director of brewing ops for the Tank in Miami, Florida, now a regional sales manager for Fermentis. Welcome, Moh.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us from South Florida. Of course, we'll kick some things off with some short introductions before we dive into the subject at hand. So Matt, why don't you give us just the quick 1 minute background on you for those folks who have not listened to the full episode that we recorded earlier this year.
So I got into brewing, I guess, kind of through home brewing, and interned at a brewery while I was studying microbiology at Clemson. Started working full-time at a brewery even before I graduated. Once I graduated, I was really working full-time. I was working at Thomas Creek Brewery, Greenville, South Carolina. Worked there for a few years, worked my way up to head brewer, moved to Germany to study at VLB. And after I graduated from VLB, moved to Florida. Worked at a brew pub for 5.5 years, brewing primarily German lagers. Opened my own spot, Odd Breed Wild Ales, focused on mixed culture beers aged in barrels. And now I'm out in Colorado, working at Dillon Dam Brewery, making a lot of different styles, but also a lot of lagers.
So VLB to Wild Ale, and then now back into the broader kind of range, making a whole bunch of lagers. Good stuff. Good stuff. Andrew, for those, again, who did not listen to the full episode with Human Robot, and of course you should, if you haven't listened to that full episode, go back and listen to it. Give us your background in a nutshell.
Sure. So, like Matt, started with home brewing, ended up sort of bothering a guy who's since become a very good friend of mine who I knew was brewing somewhere. Brew pub called Barron Hill, no longer around. So I was a freebie for him for about 6 months, and then ended up taking a job at a place called St. Benjamin Brewing. Was head brewer there for 2 or 3 years, and then moved to a place called Mainstay. Worked under Brian O'Reilly from Sly Fox. He opened Mainstay in 2017. I was there for a little over a year, and then Human Robot took over my old brewery. I came in to consult for them a little bit, and just ended up sticking on. So I've been with them since 2020, and we're just pretty much lager-focused brewery, but we do make hazy IPA and a little bit of fruit beer. Made a Saison last year for the first time in a long time. Used to do a lot of Belgian stuff at the brew pub. So, but yeah, we're lager-focused brewery. That's, probably 75% of what we do.
It's not all milk tubes, but
there's a lot of milk tubes.
but there's a lot of milk tubes. Sure. All right, Mo, tell us your story.
So, like most people in this industry, except Matt, actually, I kind of landed in it by accident. Started as a home brewer, ended up just getting offered a job at a brewery. It was a fun experience because it was a brewery that hadn't opened yet. So it was just 4 walls and a ceiling. There was completely empty, and we had to build everything up from scratch, from the recipes to the production process, SOPs, etc. After 8.5 years, I got offered a gig to switch over to Fermentis. Here I manage the eastern half of the US. Most of my days are spent helping brewers succeed with our products, technical support, education, conferences, etc. Really just drawing on previous experience and stuff I'm learning now to help brewers, succeed with what they want to do.
Let's start off with a big broad question. As lager brewing has always been a part of craft beer, but I think most people, in the early days of craft beer, a lot of craft brewing defined itself against lager brewing because that lager was such a big macro category. And of course, in the mid last decade, we started watching a lot of that kind of resistance to lager brewing chip away, and more folks embracing that. And then I think through that pandemic, with brewers who had tank space and time to do it, and some interest and inspiration from some of those craft brewers that jumped into that kind of thing with focus, we just saw a lot more lager brewing pop up in this craft brewing world. So at first it was, hey, let's brew a lager, and now of course we are well past that whole point, and the idea of just making a lager is now, how do we build a portfolio of lagers? How do we also find ideas of individual expression and character? Because the things that we all love about great lagers from European breweries is not that they're all iterations of the same thing, but that they are all expressions of those breweries and some intention, from the way that those breweries make them. And so finding that kind of way to make lagers that have your own character in them, but doing them with the same, with ingredients that lots of people have access to, becomes the challenge that craft brewers face today. And also finding ways to build range in that so that there are some different expressions that keep you interested, that keep customers interested, is all kind of things. So maybe we'll just start that broadly. Andrew, maybe you'll take this one from the first perspective. Like when you think about, how to, in a broad sense, build character in your lager, where do you start in that kind of process? You have been carving out a space for the way that Human Robot lager expresses itself, so that it has this thing that, this human robotness to it. What are some of the things that you focus on in order to, have that kind of through line through the lager beers that you make?
Sure. So, you're right. Everybody has, access to the same ingredients. Like our house Pils is 7.5 bags of either Weirmann or Best Pils malt, 1 box of Hallertau Mittelfrüh, and we pitch 3470 to it. So, to make that different than somebody else who's doing the same thing, we start with mashing is a big part of our program. We sort of shoot for a little bit lower attenuation than most people and try to get some longer chain sugars without resorting to using any crystal malts or even any kind of chip malt or anything like that. It's just 100% Pils base. And I think that substrate helps the yeast to sort of do what we want it to do as well. I don't have any formal education on that subject, so it's all just based on 10 years of messing with it really at this point. But for us, I think the key thing that I really look for in the beer is the profile of the sulfur in the finished beer. And that's something that I think is dependent mostly on your fermentation temperature. We generally don't go for squeaky clean. So if we're doing, say, a Czech style lager as opposed to a German style lager, the Czech style lager is going to get knocked out colder. It's going to get fermented colder all the way through, and rather than stepping up for diacetyl reduction, we step it down, and we just hold it longer. It just takes longer to process. And I wouldn't say that those beers have more sulfur in our brewery, but it's definitely a different presentation, as opposed to the German lager where we'll step up from 9C to 11.5 or 12C towards the end of fermentation. And then, keeping that natural carbonation, I think that's a bigger difference maker than any ingredient on the hot side or than any process you're going to do. The natural carbonation is what lager is to me and to our brewery.
I love this idea that you're using the same 3470 strain for both the German lager and the Czech lager, and it's simply just a different fermentation profile. The Czech being this more historical form of lowering and then long lagering, so that those the yeast and that can reabsorb some of those distracting compounds that otherwise might be there through your diacetyl rest, which of course we now know. And there's some great episodes we've done in the past, like Chris Loring talked extensively about the whole that whole process in the past, and of course we talked about it when we did that full episode last year at one point, that that uptake of diacetyl in this kind of form, it's the reason that Czech brewers tend to have a, should we say, inconsistent approach to diacetyl, where there are times where diacetyl is more controlled, and there are times when diacetyl is less controlled. And you tend to find that when they're producing the most beer in the midst of that summer season, that things might get moved out a little bit faster and have a little heavier diacetyl in it. But talk to me about that kind of difference. I think that's interesting that the sulfur the component and the way that it expresses in the beer is a little bit different between those two things. How do you describe those, from a sensory perspective?
So we sort of always refer to it, and it's just temperature. We say high sulfur and low sulfur here. And it's not the amount, because all of the beer is, I think, compared to most breweries, we definitely just are like, we embrace the sulfur. It's like very characteristic of our beer. There's like H2S, and Matt, you probably know the difference more than I would, being somebody who's been to brewing school. But we're looking for that more of a struck match kind of a sulfur than like a stinky cheese kind of a sulfur. And I would just say in the 12C finished fermentations, it presents as just being a little bit lighter, and it sort of jumps out the glass at you a little more, though, where in the lower temperature firms, you notice it more in the brewery. It's actually less part of the character of the beer, even though there's probably ultimately more sulfur in there. And then the lower temperature firms, it's a lot easier to get higher carbonation. So we don't cap the tanks quite as hard. We cap at 1 bar for 12C, and then we cap at about 0.6, which is probably 8 or 9 PSI at 7C in the Czech lagers. So they're holding on to more, but we're letting more go. It's hard to describe, the main difference there, but definitely it comes through in the beer. And we're also using different malt, so the attenuation levels are pretty different between those two beers as well.
Sure. How's the hopping difference in there? Because, those hops will also contribute to some of the way that people perceive that sulfur character.
Yeah. IBU wise, they're pretty close. I think we've sent them out, but it's been a while. The Hallertau Pils is about 32 IBUs. The 10 Plato Czech lager is somewhere in the mid 20s. But alphas have gone all over the place since we set those beers out. So it's all based on, tasting the beer and, maybe upping them or lowering them a little bit. The hopping rate's not that different between them, though. The Czech 10's lower gravity, it probably gets about 20% less hops. And one beer's 10.5 Plato, the other beer's 12 Plato. So if you look at it as like IBU over Plato, probably about the same hopping rate.
Sure. Well, Matt, let's talk, from your perspective, as you think about, building out a range of lagers. How do you think about, fermentation in this kind of lager space, and how you build, either intentional character for, to execute on a specific style in a specific way that you're looking for, or building some kind of Dillon Dam through line through some of these?
Yeah, so I think differentiation is important. I think with pretty much all lagers, and one of the things that I really enjoy a lot about them personally is just the drinkability. And I think that's also perhaps why lagers were not so fully embraced by craft brewers initially, was that they wanted things that were so full flavored, aggressive, assertively different from your macro beers. And with lagers, I really try to approach them from the standpoint of drinkability, repeatability, consistency, and simplicity with regards to the recipe. I think it's a lot about doing the little things right. I don't use a ton of different malts. I don't use a ton of different hops. Hallertau Mittelfrüh is the main hop in the brewery here. I do use some Tettnanger also, but and I use Magnum for bittering. And I like using 3470 for more malt-driven styles. I use S189 for our German pills. I don't make any Czech style lagers. Maybe I will someday. I'm not really well versed in those, but because I'm here at a brew pub, I try to make beers that go well with our food, and I want to have beers that represent kind of the whole gamut, regarding bitterness, dryness, sweetness, body, and color. Because you get a lot of people who come in for the first time, and that's what they're going to look at first is the color of the beer. And with a lot of people, there's still that stigma that the darker beers are going to be really intense. And I've got a rot beer on right now, and it's actually been selling pretty well. And I feel like it kind of checks a lot of boxes. I try to explain to people that, if you like an Irish red ale or an American red ale, you may find some similarities to it, but it's, I think, more easy drinking than any of those. But, for our Helles, which has become our number one seller, that was a style I introduced right after I got here. They were previously kind of going back and forth between a Mexican lager and a light lager, and I didn't really want to do that. The geography where I am right here reminds me a lot of Bavaria, and so I've kind of leaned in on a lot of those classic German styles, and I wanted to do a Helles that I felt like was very easy drinking, very approachable. I think I've slowly been making it maybe a little bit more authentic as far as what I've tasted in Germany. And so initially I was fermenting at 54 degrees. Sorry, I work in Fahrenheit mostly. I do some things in Celsius, but I kind of go back and forth. Anyway, so I was fermenting at 54. I've actually since lowered that to 52 now. And I was also filtering down to 2 micron. And the idea was to try to make that beer as approachable as possible. I don't want to say dumbed down, but I guess that's maybe a good way to put it. I didn't want people that were asking about our light lager and why I'm not brewing it anymore to be upset when they tried that beer and felt like it was too full flavored. But that beer is one that, I'm actually in the past, and I'm leaning towards introducing more sulfur into it because that's what I like personally. But initially I wanted that beer to be, just very clean, not too much character, but really showcase the clean malt character. I use a combination of Weirmann pills with a little bit of Barca pills, basically 2-to-1. Hallertau Mittelfrüh, Magnum for bittering, Mittelfrüh for flavor, and then a small dose, 10 minutes left in the boil. But it's meant to just be a really easy drinking, crushable beer. Our we make a Vienna lager that's also one of our best sellers, and that's got more of those toasted malt characters to it. That was a beer actually that I inherited when I started here. I did change the recipe around a good bit because I believe it initially had 7 malts in it, and I felt like that was just really excessive. So I think I'm down to 3 or 4 in there now. I don't remember, but that's also 3470. That's a 52 Fahrenheit fermentation. I just brewed a double batch of that about a month ago. It'll sit in tank for another 6 to 8 weeks until I need to filter it. We go through a lot of beer over the winter season here with all the tourists for coming in for ski season, and so we'll go through a lot of that pretty quickly. When I first got here, I was brewing 15 barrel batches, just single brews to the brew house, and quickly realized I was having to push lagers out in 30 days, and I didn't like that. So now I'm doing double batches and really getting ready for the winter season. But otherwise, I've got a Hellesbach on for people who want something a little more sweet, more full bodied, a little more alcoholic. I did a seasonal Doppelbock. We're out of that now. But yeah, German Pils is actually probably my personal favorite that I have on right now.
Well, let's talk about, I think you threw in there that you prefer 3470 for some of your more malt forward. When we say malt forward, that does include Helles and some of these pale lagers where they're just more malt than hop oriented, versus S189 for German Pils. What do you find that from 3470 that supports some of that more malt forward lager character?
So I talked with Moh about this a little bit. I don't know if he's dug up any research, if Fermentis has this research on it, but I feel like 3470 is a higher glycerol producing strain. It seems to me to give the impression of body. It's a high attenuating strain, especially for a lager, and the numbers show that it attenuates, for me anyway, pretty much the same as S189. And pretty similarly to S23 as well. But I feel like it really kind of showcases the malt character. I love a fresh Helles, and with 3470, I feel like it really helps that malt character pop. If you're making a Helles and you're using cheap malt, I feel like 3470 is gonna show that. But if you're using great malt, it's also gonna show that. So. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's just my personal impression that I get of it.
I can actually. So we don't actually have any research on why, but Fermentis does a ton of R&D on our strains, and we have done a lot of comparative studies in a bunch of different styles using many of our lager strains. And interestingly enough, and kind of a testament to what you're saying, S23 consistently comes out on top as far as the way it accentuates malt character in general, but 3470 also consistently comes out like right there with it, maybe a close second. So I don't know if we have any research to tell you why, but it's something we see. Part of these assessments are done. We have a really awesome sensory program at Fermentis. I think they're up to like 60 or 70 different trained panelists. I mean, these are people they're not necessarily brewers. It's actually kind of the best thing, right? They're people who can identify in the least biased way possible what compounds they're detecting, right? And so we'll run these side by sides blind through these panels. And yeah, 3470 consistently comes out as accentuating malt character a lot. And I actually find it interesting too that you're using S189 for the Pilsner as well, because that's an application I recommended for pretty often. It has this S189 has this floral kind of character consistently in these sensory panels, or that's the resulting aroma that is described. And it's really good at kind of showcasing the hops in an unadulterated way. Whereas maybe some of our strains might make them fruitier. This really accentuates that floral herbal hop character you get from a lot of those classic noble hops. So it's an excellent choice for those. And you're spot on with the attenuation side of these. S189, S23, 3470, they all attenuate about the same. So it's there's not that much. There's a lot less genetic variation among Pastorianus lager strains than there is among Yale strains. Like, you're not going to find a POF positive yeast strain in the lager world, right? You shouldn't, at least. Stuff like that. But they're typically not massive ester producers. They're just younger strains, right? They evolved relatively recent. So, but I think that as much as process plays, a big role, obviously there's some genetic differences. And I think what Andrew kind of nailed it too with the 3470. 3470 is really famous for its neutrality. It just always delivers. I joke that it's never the wrong choice. You can use it for just at your small brew pub, at an industrial brewery with high pressure lager fermentations. You could use it at really warm temperatures, still deliver a neutral beer. It's a great strain for lager. It's very resistant and tolerant of temperature changes and process changes. It just delivers a neutral profile overall. What you might see a difference in, and this is what we saw in our research, is maybe the length of the fermentation, more than like ester and higher alcohol production, for example. But to go back to what Andrew said, your diacetyl uptake times will slow down significantly at colder temperatures. And this isn't part of the research. One of the limitations of that study was that the coldest temperature tested was 12C or 54 Fahrenheit. But I will say I have some anecdotal experience myself on this that matches up with Andrew. I think at colder temperatures, you can get a little more sulfur. So yeah, I think that, it's pretty spot on what these guys are saying.
Matt, talk to us about using S189 for your German Pilsner. That's it seems like an interesting choice to you since you already are using 3470 for most of everything else. There has to be a lot of intention around using a different yeast for this one beer. So it has to be accomplishing something directly that you're looking for to add the additional production inefficiency that around that. Tell me about why you made that choice and how you use it to accentuate what you're looking for in that Pilsner.
So I started using it because Moh recommended it.
That's the perfect reason to use it. Everybody should do that.
So I like using a lot of different yeast strains. I always have. That's always been something that's just kind of drawn my curiosity. The first time I used S189, I actually used it for an American Pils. And it was I was trying to make a beer inspired by Postcard Pils from Green Bench, one of my favorite beers. The beer did not turn out like Green Bench Postcard Pils. It was good. It didn't really taste like an American Pilsner. It tasted like a German Pilsner. And I also made the mistake, and I normally talk with Moh a lot more when I'm using a strain for the first time. I don't know why I didn't talk to him more about fermentation temperature. That was my mistake. But I fermented it a little too cold, I think. I fermented it at 50, and I increased the temp to 52, and I spunded the tank when I did that. And that beer produced a good bit of SO2, more than I wanted. I ended up off-gassing the tank. That helped out some. Overall, I was still pretty happy with the beer, and was really interested in using that strain for German Pils, like Moh originally recommended. And the beer sold really well. I had a lot of people that really liked it. A lot of people commented on the most used adjective for that beer was crispness. And a lot of people talked about how hoppy it was. And it was all American hops, and it was, Crystal and Liberty. So it's not like I was using some IPA type hops. And the beer was like 32, 33 IBUs. So it wasn't excessively hoppy or bitter. All the hops were in the kettle. I wasn't dry hopping or anything. But anyway, that experience with the strain led me to realize that I should use it for a German Pils, which is something I wanted to brew anyway, but also that I needed to increase the temperature, like Moh said, more at the end of fermentation, ferment it a little bit warmer to rid off some of that SO2 production, and not spund it so early. And those changes made all the difference. The beer still that yeast still produces some SO2, which I like, and I feel like that sulfur component really is kind of the thumbprint, to me anyway, of a good German Pils. But it seems to accentuate that dry, crisp character. It really highlights the hops that are in the beer, and it's but it tastes like a noble hop character, as Moh said. That kind of herbally floral character. It works perfect with those classic German hops. The hops that I use in my German Pils are even mix of Hallertau Mittelfrüh and Saphir for flavor and aroma, and with a little bit of German Magnum for bittering.
Moh, another lager yeast that you all offer, S23, is when we don't have someone to directly advocate for here, but there are, and we certainly trying to put this episode together. We're trying to hunt somebody down, and but there are some award-winning brewers that are also using S23. What are some of the, in a broad kind of creative sense, some of the use cases for S23 and why some of the brewers that you work with make that choice in their lagers?
Yeah. Well, actually, Matt actually has some experience with S23. S23 came from the VLB, and I think Matt used it some over there, although I've been trying to convince him to use it some more or less. I think he said he used it too much there or something like that. So Matt has some experience. I'm not sure if he's used it recently, but and maybe Andrew has. I don't think Andrew and I have ever spoken about that, but S23 in general, I think the key points, and I like to use 3470 as a benchmark versus these other strains, because this strain everybody knows. S23 produces a little more esters. I mean, it's still a lager at the end of the day, right? It's not extremely fruity, but it produces a little more esters than 3470. It tends to I would describe it as accentuate hoppiness in a fruity way. It was we did a benchmark study comparing a bunch of our different lager strains, and it releases a lot of thiols from hop precursors, maybe more so than some of the others, although we have another strain coming that releases a ton more than all these other strains that we have been on the market for a while now. But overall, the thing that always strikes me, and again, it's something I don't have a direct answer to why, and maybe somebody else from Fermentis does, but I haven't seen it in our presentations or the research that I've read at least, is that it really accentuates malt character. That sweet, wordy malt character that we keep talking about, it definitely accentuates that a lot consistently in all of our comparisons.
Really good beer that I believe is brewed with S23, Puesto Clara, a pale Mexican lager, Mexican-inspired lager. I'm in San Diego. It's anyway, beautiful beer when I was down there in San Diego a couple of months ago. And, I think could, also work really nicely with the kind of corn character and Mexican lager and, highlight some of that, note in the beer itself. Anyway, some interesting, Matt, have you brewed anything interesting with S23, or are you still just, in PTSD over it?
So I used S23 exclusively for 7 months when I was in Germany. We brewed almost every Saturday. And we made almost exclusively pilsners with it, and I think it's a good strain. I got a little tired of it personally, but I think that it has great applications. I think Mexican lager is one of them. I think American adjunct lager is a good choice. If you want to make some malt liquor, I think it's a great choice. And as Moh said, the maltiness does seem to be accentuated with that kind of that sweet, wordy character. It does lend some of like a fruity, estery character from the hops that I think is great with Mexican lagers. So I think if you want to make a Mexican lager, I think that's probably the best strain. It's the way to go. I've tried using a little bit of it in some blends with 3470, and then also once with S89. And I think it added some interesting character. Not sure if I'm going to go back to it or not. But it's like any tool in your toolbox. It's got a purpose. It's not my favorite strain, but if I were making a Mexican lager, it would be for sure.
If I could add to what Matt's saying there too, I often recommend S23 to brewers that are looking for something a little bit different than 3470, right? So they're like, I know what 3470 does. It delivers a neutral character. I want a less neutral character. And there's nothing wrong with that. For a long time, I feel like craft beer brewers were proud of portraying or displaying, I should say, how good they were at brewing and how clean they can make a beer, and they took pride in that. And now it's kind of evolved past that, where people are looking for more creativity, more individuality in their beers. And I think a perfect example of that's how we keep talking about sulfur. I think maybe even you, Jamie, and all three of us definitely look for sulfur in a lager. I want that sulfur character. If it's not there, it's something's missing for me. That's just my personal subjective taste. So somebody might call that an off flavor, but it's something that we're looking for. And just like I might recommend S23 to somebody making a Czech lager, I think it's a great choice for that. Andrew's doing a fantastic job making Czech lagers with 3470. So a lot of this, like we mentioned earlier, these strains, they're more similar than they are different a lot of times. And sometimes it's your process that makes it different. choosing a different strain can definitely help. And there's definitely things that you can unlock with certain strains that you can't with others. But making great beer is not just a add, subtract, algebraic formula where you just plug and play things and good beer pops out. It's all about experience. It's all about knowledge and utilizing your tools and getting to know them and experimenting with them. So
100%. I love to think about it with this kind of metaphor. Like if we think about how attractive things are that are distressed, whether that's like, gritty kind of character in a graphic design, or, a weathered look, finish on a piece of furniture. We even create faux finishes for things to amplify that little bit of distress. We love distressed jeans, that bit of kind of entropy, that little bit of kind of, chaos and wear adds a feel to it that is comfortable for us, that's maybe more accessible. And if something is perfect, and just pristine, and like, you walk into a white modernist room where every surface is gleaming, it doesn't have the same kind of character and kind of feel. And so I think, that is exactly where we are with lager brewing, in America now, understanding that you figure out how to make it perfect, and then you figure out how to add that kind of distress to it that creates a kind of warm and comfortable feeling, so that they don't feel put off by that kind of perfection. In that sense, Andrew, maybe we'll go back and talk a bit again about how you use 34-7, because you're using this, again, in German, style lagers and Czech style lagers. Are there any other, kind of lager styles that you've explored, other ways to push 3470 itself in some of these different character avenues?
Sure. I mean, the other factor that we do a little bit different is with dry hopped beers, we'll allow that temp to come up a little bit more, and we're looking for a cleaner beer just to showcase, if we're doing Italian Pilsner or West Coast Pilsner, or Whisper West Coast IPA, you can run that yeast pretty warm, and
it's not a secret anymore.
Yeah. We haven't done that much. We'll usually still just bring in a little SO5 and do it. But we have done a couple of ale styles with it. And, even at my old job at Mainstay, I think we did an English porter, and it was like 3470 at 18C. And, beer was like grain to glass, and I don't even remember, but way shorter than I thought he could do it, And my boss over there knows the strain very well, and he was just like, it's fine, crash it. And the beer came out great. I was very, very surprised by that. I think he was showing off a little bit. He was a veteran guy, and I was a little younger. So, but yeah, we'll use 3470 for West Coast pills, and kind of try to run a little bit cleaner fermentation, as well as like a more straightforward mashing. We still decoct those beers, but not in the way that we do like our German pills, but it's a much lighter malt profile.
How do in that sense, what's a lighter decoction for a West Coast pills look like versus a heavier decoction for Czech or German? Yeah,
so I mean, we're tailoring it to attenuate a little bit more, given the yeast a sort of simpler sugar profile to eat. So slightly longer first rest in a sort of zone where all the enzymes are working together, 64 to 65 C, about 150. We'll do that for 25 to 30 minutes, and then just pull a third, bring it straight to boil with no rest, and send it back over to hit a mash off, 75 C range. As opposed to like our German pills is a lower temperature mash in where we're only really looking for beta for about 20 minutes, split the mash, send half of it to 70 C to convert, and then boil all of that, and we send that back in 2 parts. So that's a really malt forward, especially for a Pilsner. It's a very malt forward beer, certainly more inspired by the type of Pilsner you're going to drink in, Bamberg, not North German dry, sharp Pilsner. It's just not the style that beer is. It's always a holistic approach, and the fermentation is part of that. We have a beer called Bergenstrasse, which sort of straddles the German and Czech style fermentations that we do, because it's based on like Spezial U or Mars U. We do a smoked version and an unsmoked version. So it's closer to the Czech style fermentation, because that was my first lager experience outside of the U.S. was Prague and Bamberg. So very malt forward drinking cities. And coming from the U.S., you're thinking like, I can't wait to get some of that clean German lager. And then you go there and drink it, and it's so complex, and there's so much going on, and you're like, nobody told me it was going to be like this, And yet it still is very dry, and while it's also so expressive for all of those different reasons. Yeah. It was just my impression of what I was going to taste and what I ended up tasting were two very different things. And then, certainly came home, back to the brewery, tasted pills off the bright tank, and said, we got a lot of work to do, This was 2016 or 2017, I think, when I was working for St. Benjamin Brewing.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about, I like this idea of talking about it in the hoppy lager context, Italian pills, West Coast pills. Matt, have you played in that realm, and, and is there a fermentation approach that you like in that kind of space?
So I haven't experimented with those recently. Before I opened Odd Breed, the brew pub I was working at, I did a lot of lagers, always had lager yeast going. And so I don't think it was really a thing yet, but I made a beer that was basically a New Zealand style hoppy Pilsner, West Coast Pilsner, whatever you want to call it. And I believe I used the Augustiner yeast on that one. But this was going back like maybe 12, 13 years. Haven't done anything like that since. It's definitely something I'm interested in, though.
All right, that goes too far back. So you keep it pretty clean on those, Andrew, and are looking for this kind of minimal character. Are there any other kind of approaches to fermentation you take when malt isn't the focus and that kind of hop expression is what you're really looking for?
I guess they're all still spooned. It's still dry hop stuff isn't 100% naturally carbonated because you do lose some gas. But we do closed dry hopping, so it's not, we don't have to worry about the tank, exploding on us. Used to try to throw hops in, and one bad day, we never did it again. So we basically just, when we pump out of one fermenter to a bright tank, we'll just gas that tank down, throw the hops in it, repressurize it, verify the purge with the DO meter, and just transfer right into it. You got to trust that your cellar's clean to do that, but we've been doing it that way for a couple years now, and saves the cleaning, saves the gas. So that works for us, and we just did it yesterday. So did some New Zealand pills, dry hops.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
If you're using some of those, modern hops for dry hopping, do you, how do you adjust or do you see any kind of hop creep or additional fermentation activity at that point? Does it change the process for, kind of, again, retesting for, VDKs or any, kind of acetaldehyde or any of the other, kind of characters, the off characters that can come from that additional fermentation, or is it mostly just it's so dry at that point that there's not much else that can happen?
Yeah, we haven't really seen hop creep in the lagers. Early on, with our Italian pills, we had a batch that came up with diacetyl in package, like maybe a month after. We sent it out for lab work, never really. We had some welding going on our tanks, and people were climbing around inside of them, and we hadn't repassivated them. This was like 2 months after we opened, maybe. So we just kind of chalked that up to maybe we dry hopped it too early and didn't want it on the hops too long. But really, since then, we have not had any hop creep issues in the lagers, occasionally in the ales, but it just hasn't come up for us. We don't dry hop really at the same rate as hazy IPA or something where you're pretty much going to get hop creep. Even West Coast Pils is somewhere in that 2 pound per barrel range. It's not 6 pounds per barrel like a double IPA, something like that.
Moh, are there some other folks out there that you work with that are doing some interesting things with this kind of this hoppy lager space? And what are some of the ways that they're using fermentation either to just push those hops forward or to complement those hops with some of the fermentation character?
Yeah, we definitely work with a lot of people that do that. Actually, I could even, just speaking for myself, I had a very similar approach and experience myself to Andrew. It was funny to hear him mention it because it's exactly what happened to me. We introduced a Pilsner at the brewery I worked at. And as it evolved into a hoppier Pils over time, I increased the temperature to eliminate sulfur as well. So it was actually the exact same trajectory. So it's funny to hear that. Really the popular thing these days, and we're seeing it more and more on the West Coast, and it's starting to trickle over to the East, is people using 3470 a lot at warmer temperatures for West Coast IPAs, not even just West Coast lagers, just West Coast IPAs, period. They'll ferment it at 20C. It still delivers a neutral, ester profile, works great for those kinds of beers. More and more brewers are experimenting with, these dry hopped beers that we're all familiar with now. Interestingly, we have a strain that's coming out, SH45. That strain is going to be an interesting one. I think people, I'm about to hopefully get some samples soon and start sending them out for people to trial. If you guys want some, let me know. But what's interesting about this strain is it releases a lot of thiols. It's a naturally occurring strain. It's not a genetically engineered strain or something like that, but it just naturally releases a lot of thiols, and interestingly, they're glutathione bound precursors, or they release thiols from glutathione bound precursors, which isn't typical. Most of our lager strains release from the cysteine bound precursors, which is much more common. Those G adduct glutathione bound precursors, that they're a lot more abundant in wort. So it's got a lot of potential. I've tasted some beers with it. I think that's going to be a hit. And it kind of fits in with what brewers are doing. But overall, American brewers have always loved hops. We do a great job in this country with growing. I mean, we grow the most hops in the world now, I believe, still. I think we surpassed Germany a few years ago. Processing them, developing new varieties that have a huge impact on beer. And it's just naturally, natural progression for it to make its way into lager as well, I think.
It's an interesting one, when we talk about the way that yeast can work in fermentation to pull thiols out of malt. I have a couple of times recently have had this come up on the podcast talking about particularly floor malted malt being having more thiol precursor in fermentation, being able to pull some of that out in this, not necessarily in lager styles as much as it is doing it within the kind of hoppy beer IPA space, hazy IPA and West Coast IPA for that matter, and kind of fascinating to see how those precursors in malt can be pulled out in this kind of space. Do you guys Matt or Andrew, do either of you play, or have either of you played with that kind of intentionality to use that to pull from malt itself? It's more of that thiol character.
I haven't.
Yeah, I have not done anything like that now.
Yeah, I think to get it out of malt, that's usually talking in the realm of genetically engineered strains. But there's a lot of strains like this SH45, and honestly, all of our lager strains will release from precursors. I think most of the precursors that you get in a typical wort with a typical strain is going to be from the hop side. And it's always interesting because as brewers, we almost act like thiols just came into existence like 10 years ago, but they've always been in beer, right? A lot of strains release them. It's been a big topic of conversation in the wine world for a very long time. So, we're the ones that are kind of catching up to it as well. And a lot of these hops have free thiols already. So it's always been a big part of, what brewers are looking for in the flavor profile of the beers that they're making, even if they didn't know what they were, tasting. But now that brewers are educated on it and there's a demand for it, I think you're going to see more examples like this where new strains are coming out to support that and to help brewers make what they want to make.
So Andrew, what have you learned through that lager brewing process, especially with some of these with lager yeasts that might impact some of your IPA making at Human Robot?
Related to yeast, maybe not quite so much, but I will say I learned how to make a brew schedule that doesn't kill everybody by brewing lager in the morning and IPA in the afternoon, which is what we're doing today. So, we can get 2 brews in, working 8 to 4 by not brewing pills twice in a row in the same day.
Because of your absurd decaction process behind this and all the time that it takes.
We can just
slot in those ales after it just so you can,
Yeah, you drop a single infusion in once your kettle full on the first one, and you can walk out the door 2 hours earlier. But we used to spoon the IPAs a little bit more than we do now. Those we do just throw the hops in the top, and beneficial flavor wise, but just sort of practically and people falling off ladders and things, we're just not trying to have that happen anymore. So I've really striven, if that's a word, to be a brewer who doesn't, I'd really try not to carry over too much process from one style of beer to another, because to me, IPA is a single infusion beer with a ton of hops, and lager is typically step mashed or decocted here. And I've definitely talked to a lot of people and worked with people who, they mash almost every beer the exact same. And you're like, so you're going to mash in an IPA at 50C, step it up to 64, step it up to 72, step it up to 78. Like, we could have been done mashing, an hour and a half ago and came out with a better beer, was sort of always my argument with that, because, you're trying to, put a square peg into a round hole. So I try not to carry over too much outside of, good practice of, oxygen reduction and all that kind of thing. I really try to think of those as 2 very separate things in my head. But, that maybe that's just me.
That's fair. Well, let's talk about maybe some outlier lagers, some just interesting lagers. Because we're all, you guys are brewers. You take inspiration from different places. You taste some beers, like, oh, see how I can do that. And Matt, have there been some lagers? You talked about a lot of the stuff that you've been brewing lately. Some lagers that while brewing have kind of that you've learned something interesting about in trying to achieve some different goals than, say, your standard, not even standard, Czech, German, or say West Coast kind of pilsners. There's some of those lagers where you've learned whether those are higher gravity or whether those are just even more and more malt focused that you've learned through the process of brewing that have helped you become a better brewer.
I think really just kind of going back to my experiences with S189 and treating that pretty differently than 3470. 3470, I feel like, really is kind of a do-it-all sort of strain. It's great to work with. It's somewhat fail-proof. If you do everything right on your brew day, if your cleanliness and sanitation are good, you're going to make a good beer. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance that you can achieve with that strain, like Andrew pointed out, and that's awesome. With S189, I feel like if you don't treat it the right way, you may not be happy with the results. It's not as user friendly in that sense. Regarding temperature and the sulfur production, what I think is really important is increasing that temperature at the end of fermentation. With 3470, you can increase temperature at the end of fermentation. You can decrease it. You can leave it the same. Main thing is you want to give it enough time to clean up. But and even if you don't give it enough time to clean up, it's still probably going to end up being relatively clean. I think I've mentioned to you, Jamie, that I used it in primary fermentation a lot at Odd Breed before, mixed culture in barrels, and it was kind of a cool canvas for that. But with S189, you've got to treat it the right way, I feel like, and you have to kind of stick to those parameters, figuring out what works for you.
Andrew, have there been some one-off or kind of left field lagers that you've made that where you just went a different direction with 3470 to just get weird with it?
Not anything too crazy. I mean, we do a lot of fun little stuff here and there, like croisening the beer in package and conditioning the cans. We had this was actually kind of a bummer. We did a collab that we were supposed to send to an event at Goodword, and it was just too tight of a turn. And you always think like it's going to be fine. And the day I was supposed to keg it to send to the festival, I'm tasting it off the Zwickel, and I'm like, we haven't had diacetyl come up in a lager in a very long time. So I had to like reach out to Todd and be like, I got to send you something else. And we had the beer slated to be canned that day. So it was like, all right, well, we have some pills that's at, 7 Plato. We're going to run, 5% of that into the tank and can it. And then I'm going to taste cans in a week and see how long it takes until they taste good. And it was the first batch of a Czech style lager using most hops that we brewed. Turned out great in the end, but it was just kind of a bummer, at the outset, having to send a different beer. It was like supposed to be at a beer dinner, whole thing,
Oh man.
But yeah, so we've done the Kreuzen in package thing quite a bit. Definitely like killer foam out of those cans when you do that. I think it's just, you fob going into the canner. So that's going to reduce your ultimate foam at the end of the day. So getting something in there to scavenge some oxygen and not abuse the beer too much on the way through the canner.
Tell me about the parameters on that. I'm curious about can Kreuzening.
So for us, we're not trying to take it all the way. We'll probably can the beer at 2.5 volumes and then use the Kreuzen to get it up to maybe 2.7, 2.8, which is higher than our normal carb level. We'll normally can beer at about 2.6. Czech lager is a little lower, 2.5 or so. Inline canners, the beer just has to be in spec. There's not a lot of an adjustment there. So,
and so then how do you do? You're pulling this off of just a freshly fermenting batch, and how many days in or of the beer are you pulling into this?
Yeah, so if we're Kreuzening to Kreuzen into the package, we're basically we're generally either packaging 10 or 20 hectoliters. That's like the yield volume on most of the non-dry hop lagers. We know what we've got because we've got either sight glass on the bright tank or flow meter notes going. We have a couple tanks that don't have sight glasses. And we just calculate if the beer's, you have to have beer that's in the right spot. So usually we have pills going, generally package on Mondays, and that's usually the day we spooned, as long as fermentation's going okay. So take beer that's anywhere between 6 and 7 Plato and try to account for, depending on the carbonation of the beer that's in the bright tank and the gravity of the beer that we're spooning with, somewhere between 3 and 5%, and that'll just get you a nice little bump in package. If it were practical, I would do it on every single batch of beer. I mean, it's a difference maker for sure. And you definitely get a nice little sulfur pop when you pop the can too, because you have, 7 Plato beer going in there. And you're also just sort of blending, we're generally packaging Czech lager at about 30 days. We're packaging German style stuff with the 12C firm like 22 days. So quick turns. But you're getting this sort of fresh little pop as opposed to getting fully matured beer there. So even if there were some sort of off flavors there, if it's 5% of the beer, you're not really noticing that. You're just noticing that the beer has this like fresh character to it right out of the can. And when we do it at that low level, we only hold the cans generally for about 6 days. We just check the gravity, use the densitometer, make sure we're terminal, because it's not really going to throw enough of any off flavors to throw anything off. Ultimately, I think the beer
your normal fermentation temperature, or
we put them in a walk-in. Our warehouse walk-in sits in like the low 40s, that's about where we knock beer out anyway. So we just put it in there. And, if it's something that we really tried to get a lot out of and we're up in that 5 to 6% range, like we're not selling that beer for a good 10 days. But most of the time, as soon as the beer's terminal in the can, the beer's on sale. So
can conditioned lager, man, that's kind of fun. It's like every little can is its own little Fosser with
taking notes from Sierra Nevada on that. That I know that pale ale is still bottle conditioned and can conditioned, but I'm sure they're not taking it all the way. I'm sure it's just a very small amount just to scavenge some oxygen and keep that beer fresh. So that's kind of where the inspiration for that really came from.
Andrew, are you adding additional yeast, or are you just relying on the yeast that's still in the beer that you're adding?
Just the yeast. Yeah, the beer's at high Kreuzen, so I used to count it, but it seems very consistent. Even if it's 10 or 15% difference in cell count, it doesn't seem to change how it works in the beer. I'm sure it gets a little shock going into a cold bright tank, but as soon as the center of the palate sort of warms up, everything seems to be fine. Warms up from freezing to 40 or so.
Are you transferring the beer in the day that you bought that you can?
Yeah, like immediately before. Yeah,
gotcha.
And then we'll just we'll bump carb stone for 3 minutes or so, and then start packaging.
Okay. Cool.
You're pretty much always pulling on the same day, I imagine, too, right? That Krausen.
Yeah, I mean it's always gravity dependent. But yeah, we make a lot of 11 to 13 Plato pale lager here, so there's usually something somewhere around that 6 to 7 Plato range on packaging days, which is usually a Monday, sometimes a Friday.
It's interesting.
That's super cool. Super cool. So Moh, we've got to wrap this up pretty quick. If we think about high level takeaways and things that you want people to pay attention to the most on this in terms of finding kind of interesting character driven approaches to lager fermentation, what are your biggest high level takeaways?
All right. So here's my take. You got two great brewers here that have very different approaches, even with the same strain, which I think is fascinating. And I think it's a good example of not just doing things because they're traditional or because you're supposed to, or you're the very cool guy down the street said, he does it, so that's why you do it. These brewers do it, and they have very particular reasons that they can describe and qualities that it adds to the beer as to why they do it. To me, that's a big takeaway. Just always been approach in brewing that I've been a proponent of. And I think they have different reasons, but they have good reasons for choosing the strains that they choose and working on the way they do. So, I think as far as the strains go, a lot of it's process dependent for what the resulting, character will be in your beer, but there's definitely some baked in kind of characteristics that each strain has that you can take advantage of if you know how. And the perfect example that Matt mentioned earlier about S29, it's let's dumb it down to the point where he said it's more difficult to use than 3470, but he likes that character so much and it adds so much to his beer, it's worth the effort and time. And Andrew's doing a great job of taking a strain like 3470 and making a lot of different beers out of it. So overall, I would say experiment with your yeast. Don't just switch out strains every time you make a new recipe, but also don't be afraid to, would be one of my takeaways. And get to know your strains. More and more strains are coming out. That's a great thing about lager becoming more popular, which is it's a great time to be a brewer. So I would definitely take advantage of it and experiment with those.
Well, that is a great place to bring it to a close. Thanks again for joining me on this special lager fermentation focused episode of the podcast, brought to you interruption free by Fermentis. Visit fermentis.com for more information on the lager yeast we've talked about, as well as their full range of yeasts for lagers and ales. Matt, Andrew, Moh, thanks for sharing your thoughts on fermentation, flavor, yeast health, can krausening, all of those things. It's been a really fun conversation. Cheers. This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.